Greetings. Today, Jesus leaves Aruma and goes to Thanat Shiloh and Aser Michmethath. After Jesus had once more earnestly addressed the Pharisees, telling them that they had lost the spirit of their religion, that they now held only to empty forms and customs which, however, the devil had managed to fill with himself, as they might see if they looked around the pagans. He left Aruma and went to city Thanat Shiloh, outside of which stood one of the inns established by Lazarus. He instructed the men and women whom he found at work on the immense corn ricks in the field. He introduced into his discourse parables relating to agriculture and the various kinds of lands. These people were slaves and followers of the Samaritan Creed. Monday, October 16th. We're in 30 AD, Tishri the 30th. So we're almost done Tishri. That evening, Jesus taught in the synagogue. It was the feast of the new moon. Consequently, the synagogue and other public buildings were hung with wreaths of fruit. A great many sick had assembled in front of the synagogue. They were mostly afflicted with paralysis, gout, or issues of blood, and some were possessed. Jesus blessed numbers of children, both sick and well. Many of those that were paralyzed in their hands and on one side owed their sickness, in most cases, to their labors in the field and to lying on the damp earth at night or in the daytime when in a profuse perspiration. I saw such cases in the field outside of Genabris in Galilee. We are now month of Heshvan. This is 30 days. So Tuesday, October 17th. Jesus went next day to the harvest field and cured many whom he found there. Some people brought out from the city baskets of provisions, and great entertainment was spread in one of the tabernacles that still remained standing. Jesus afterward delivered a long discourse in which he spoke against unnecessary and extravagant care for the preservation of life. It means life here. He brought forward the example of the lilies. They do not spin, and yet they are clothed more beautifully than Solomon in all of his glory. Jesus said many beautiful things to the same effect of the different animals and objects around. He also taught that they should not profane the Sabbath and feasts by working for gain. For gain. Works of mercy, such as delivering a man or a beast from danger, were allowable. But as for the harvest, they should commit the care of its fruits to God's providence, and not on account of threatening weather gather them on the Sabbath. Jesus' words on this subject were very beautiful and detailed. It was almost the same kind of a sermon as that on the Mount. For he often repeated the words, "Blessed are these, blessed are those." Such instructions were much needed by the people of this place, for they were extraordinarily covetous and greedy for gain in trade and agriculture. They were wholly engrossed in their calling, and their servants were overburdened. They were charged with a collection of the tithes from the surrounding country. The sums thus coming into their possession they used to hold back for a considerable time in order to put them out at usury. The products of their fields they sold. The old people worked in wood, for which they often betook themselves to the neighboring forest. I saw them cutting in large numbers the wooden heels worn under the sandals. There are many fig orchards around the city. There were no Pharisees here. The people were rather coarse, but very proud of their descent from Abraham. The sons of Abraham, however, whom the patriarch had settled here, had soon degenerated. They intermarried with the Shechemites, and when Jacob returned to that region, the law of circumcision was already forgotten. Jacob had intended to fix his residence here, but was deterred from doing so by Dinah's seduction. Dinah's seduction. Oh, yes, okay. Just as an aside, Dinah was the 13th offspring of Israel. She was the woman, and she was seduced by that tribe. Okay, so continuing the reading. He knew the children of Abraham who dealt in those parts, and sent them presents. Dinah had gone to take a walk by the well in Salem. Some of the people in the fields, those to whom her father had sent presents, invited her to visit them. She was accompanied by her maids, but leaving them, she ventured alone into the fields, desirous of gratifying her curiosity. It was then that the Shechemites saw and ensnared her. Wherever Jesus went, the sick were collected in crowds. We shall not be surprised at this when we remember that, as soon as his presence became known in any place, they were hurried thither from the huts and villages around the whole country. Wednesday, October 18th. Here in Thanaat, the Jews and Samaritans lived separate, the former being more numerous. Jesus preached to the Samaritans also, though remaining a while on Jewish territory. His hearers were gathered on the boundary of their own quarter at the head of one of the streets. He also cured the sick. The Jews of Thanaat were not so hostile toward them as were those of other places, since here they held not so rigorously to the law, and especially to the observance of the Sabbath. Jesus cured here in diverse ways. Some cures were effected at a distance by a glance and word, some by a mere touch, some by imposition of hands. Over some of the sick he breathed, others he blessed. In the eyes of some he moistened with saliva. Many of the sick happening to touch him were cured, and others at a distance were cured without his even turning to them. Toward the close of his career, he seemed to be more rapid in his movements than in the beginning. I thought that he made use of these diligent forms of healing to show that he was bound to no single one, but could produce a similar effect by use of varied means. But he once said himself in the gospel that one kind of devil was to be expelled in one way, another in another way. He cured each in a manner analogous to the malady, his faith, and his natural temperament, as in our own time we behold him chastising some sinners and converting others. He did not interrupt the order of nature, he merely loosened the bonds that bound the sufferer. He cut no knots, he untied them, and he did everything so easily, for he possessed the key to all. Inasmuch as he had become the God-man, he treated those that he cured in a human manner. I had already been told that Jesus had healed in these different forms in order to instruct the disciples how to act in similar cases, as an exemplar. The various forms of blessings, consecrations, and sacraments made use of by the Church find their models, their modes, and those then observed by Jesus. Toward noon, Jesus left the city accompanied by several persons. He proceeded along a tolerably broad highway toward the northeast. It led to Scythopolis, with Doc upon the right and Thebes to the left, at the eastern extremity of the mountain upon which Samaria was built. He descended toward the Jordan and into a valley through which a stream flowed to the river. Here, he encountered a crowd of people, most of them Samaritan laborers who, eager to receive instruction, had hurried thither in advance of him. He found them waiting for him, and he stopped to address them. To the left of the valley and upon a height stood a little place consisting of one long row of houses. It was called Aser Michmethath, and into it Jesus entered toward evening. Abel Meholah may have been 7 hours distant. Mary and the holy women passed by Aser on their journeys to Judea when they did not take the mountainous road past Samaria. The Blessed Virgin and Joseph took this route on their flight into Egypt. That same evening, Jesus went to the well of Abraham, to the pleasure gardens outside of Aser Michmethath. There cured many sick. Among them were 2 Samaritans who had been brought thither. Jesus was very affectionately received by the people of this place. They were very good, and each one coveted the honor of showing him hospitality. But he put up outside the place with a family whose mode of life was patriarchal in its simplicity. This is important. The father was named Obed. Jesus and all the disciples were very lovingly entertained by him. The road through the country from Thanat Shiloh to this place was far wider and better than that through Achrabus to Jericho. The latter was so very narrow, so uneven and rocky that beasts of burdens could with difficulty travel it with loads of merchandise. It was under the tree near Abraham's well that in the time of the judges, the false prophetess carried on her sorcery and gave advice that always turned out disastrously. She used to perform all kinds of ceremonies there at night by the light of torches, calling up her incantations, singular figures of animals, etc. She was nailed to a board by the Midianites at Azo. This took place under the same tree beneath which Jacob buried the idols plundered from the Shechemites. Joseph and the Blessed Virgin and Jesus had lain concealed a day and a night near that tree on their flight into Egypt, for Herod's persecution had been proclaimed, and it was very unsafe to travel in those parts. I think, too, on the journey to Bethlehem when Mary was so chilled by the cold, it was near this tree she suddenly became warm. Hello, Joseph Torellia. Anyways, if you know who that is, you'll know what I'm referring to. Okay. Aser Michmethath lay across a mountain ridge that descends toward the valley of the Jordan. The southern side of the mountain belonged to Ephraim, the northern to Manasseh. Those are the 2 tribes of Joseph. On the former, that is Ephraim, stood Michmethath, on the latter Aser, the 2 forming but one city called Aser Michmethath. The boundary ran between them. The synagogue was in Aser. The inhabitants of the 2 quarters were dissimilar in their customs and had little communication. Mickhmethath, the quarter belonging to the tribe of Ephraim, extended up the mountain in one long line of houses. Below in the valley was a little stream by which Jesus had instructed the Samaritans who had preceded him hither. A little beyond this point, nearer to the entrance of the city, was a beautiful well surrounded by baths and pleasure gardens. The well, access to which was by a flight of steps, consisted of a solid basin in whose terraced center rose the tree to which I have more than once alluded. From this reservoir surrounding bathing cisterns were fed. It was here that Jesus cured the 2 Samaritan women. Obed's house was on a large estate outside of Mickhmethath. He was a kind of chief or head magistrate of the place. The inhabitants of this quarter were for the most part related to one another, and several of the families were either those of Obed's own children or those of his other relatives. In his character of eldest and chief, Obed managed their business, directed their agriculture and pastoral affairs. His wife, with her housekeeping and the female portion of the family, occupied a separate part of the house. She was still quite a vigorous old Jewess. She had a kind of school, taught the young girls of the other families all sorts of handiwork. Charity, wise counsels, and industry reigned throughout the whole house. Obed had 18 children, some of whom were still unmarried. 2 of his daughters had wedded husbands from Aser, the quarter belonging to Manasseh. This was a cause of regret to Obed. So I learned from his conversation with Jesus, for the people of Aser were not the best in the world, and their customs were very different from those of their sister city. Thursday, I'll have notes on that one for sure. Thursday, October 19th. Next morning, Jesus preached near the well to an audience of about 400 people, all ranged around on the grass of the terraced declivity. He spoke in significant terms of the approach of the kingdom, of his own mission, of penance, of baptism. He also prepared some for the last named ceremony, that is baptism, among whom were Obed's children. After that, accompanied by Obed, he went to some dwellings in the field where he consoled and instructed the servants and aged persons who had had to remain at home while the others prepared for this sermon. Obed conversed long with Jesus of Abraham and Jacob, who had once sojourned in this region, and of Dinah's misfortune. The inhabitants of Michmethath looked upon themselves as descendants from Judah. Holofernes, the Midian adventurer, had at his invasion quite ruined this place, and after that the ancestors of these people settled here with the firm determination to live together according to ancient pious customs. Now, Holofernes, that's a reference from the book of Judith. So, continuing. This they had done down to the present. Obed followed the ancient usages of the pious Hebrews and reverenced Job in an especial manner. He amply provided for his sons and daughters on their settlement in life, and at every marriage in his family he gave large offerings to the poor and to the temple. Jesus blessed numbers of children everywhere presented to him by their mothers. That afternoon there was a grand entertainment given in the open space around Obed's house and in the courtyard under the tabernacles, which were still standing everywhere. Almost all of the inhabitants of Michmethath took part in it, especially the poor in the whole region. Jesus went around to all the tables, blessing and teaching and lovingly helping with the various dishes. He related many parables. The women were seated in a separate tabernacle. Afterward, Jesus visited and cured some sick in their homes, and again blessed many little ones presented to him by their mothers, who stood ranged in a row. There were a great many children present, especially around Obed's wife, for she had many pupils. Obed had a little son of about 7 years, and with him Jesus exchanged many words. The boy had lived in the field at the house of one of his elder brothers. He was an exceedingly pious child and often knelt out in the field at night to pray. This did not please the elder brother, and Obed felt himself a little anxiety about the boy, but Jesus' words restored peace to their anxious hearts. After his death, the boy joined the disciples. I'm guessing Obed's death. The boy joined the disciples. In the war of the Maccabees, Mickhmethath remained true and had rendered much help to the Jews. Judas Maccabeus himself sojourned here at different times. Obed took Job for his model in all things and led in the bosom of his large family a life altogether patriarchal. All right, buckle up. Still got more reading. Friday, October 20th. When Jesus went into the other part of the city, the quarter belonging to the tribe of Manasseh, he found near the synagogue some Pharisees, not the best disposed toward himself, and many arrogant citizens. They were friends and supporters of those that collected the taxes and imposts for the Romans, which they afterward put out at usury. Jesus taught and then cured the sick. The Pharisees and proud citizens treated Jesus with coldness and indifference. They were displeased at his having visited the simple rustic people of Mickhmethath before honoring their own city with his presence, because they come first. They had no love for him, and yet they were ambitious for his first visit as a learned doctor to be to themselves, rather than to their unsophisticated neighbors, upon whom they looked down. Jesus, accompanied by a crowd of people, went back to the well outside of Michmethath and began preparations for the ceremony of baptism. Many confessed their sins in general terms, while many others, going in private to Jesus, made them known in detail and asked for penance and pardon. Saturnin and Joseph Barsabas performed the ceremony of baptism, the other disciples acting as sponsors. It took place in an immense bathing cistern. After the baptism, Jesus returned to Aser for the Sabbath. He preached from Genesis 18, verse 23. It has FF here. 23 forward, I guess, maybe. Of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and then taking up the miracles recorded of Elisha. He spoke in a strong language on the necessity of penance. His words were not pleasing to the Pharisees, for he reproached them with their contempt for the publicans, while they themselves were secretly practicing usury, though hiding the fact under the sanctimonious exterior. Saturday, October 21st. After he had again taught in the synagogue at Aser, his subjects being Abraham and Elisha, he cured many sick, some of them demoniacs and others possessed by the spirit of melancholy. Hello. That afternoon a dinner was given in the public house. The Pharisees had issued invitations. But ignoring that fact, Jesus invited many poor people as the inhabitants of Michmethath, and ordered the disciples to defray all expenses. While at table, he had a warm discussion with the Pharisees, whereupon he related the parable of the unjust debtor who desired the remission of his own debts. Though oppressing others on account of theirs, Jesus applied the parable to themselves. They extorted taxes from the poor and at the same time deceived the Romans by pocketing the proceeds and declaring the people unable to pay, or again by levying high taxes, only a third part of which was delivered over to the Romans. The Pharisees tried to justify themselves, but Jesus silenced them with the words, "Render unto Kaiser that which is Kaiser's, and to God that which is God's." In their fury, they exclaimed, "What's that to him?" Sunday, October 22nd. A fast day commemorative of the putting out of Zedekiah's eyes by Nebuchadnezzar had begun. That's a heck of a thing to feast about or fast about. Jesus preached in the fields among the shepherds and at Abraham's well. He spoke of the kingdom of God, declaring that it would pass from the Jews to the Gentiles. Ooh, they must have hated that. The latter of whom would even attain preeminence over the former. Obed afterward remarked to Jesus that if he preached to the Gentiles in that strain, they might possibly become proud. Jesus replied very graciously and explained that it was just on account of their humility that they should reach the first place. And remember that this is like the older, younger brother syndrome of Genesis. If you know that theme, you'll know what I'm talking about. This is an if you know kind of thing. He warned Obed and his people against the feeling of conscious rectitude and self-complacency to which they were predisposed. They, in a measure, distinguished themselves from their neighbors, and on account of their well-regulated life, their temperance, and the fruits of salvation amassed thereby, they esteemed themselves good and pleasing in the sight of God. Such sentiments might very easily end in pride. To guard against such a consequence, Jesus related the parable of the day laborers. He instructed the women also in their own separate pleasure garden, in which was a beautiful bower. To them he related the parable of the wise and the foolish virgins. So, I'll pause here again. The laborers is the one where they pick up laborers at 6 in the morning, then at 9 in the morning, and at last they pick them up at 3 in the afternoon. And that's when the ones that were picked up at 6 in the morning complained about how much they were paid. So Jesus is relating that the Gentiles are like the people who were picked up at like 12 or 3 in the afternoon. 3 in the afternoon happened to be the hour of his death. So anyways, let's continue. While so engaged, Jesus stood, and they sat around him in a terraced circle, one above the other. They sat on the ground with one knee slightly raised and on it resting their hands. All the women on such occasions wore long mantles or veils that covered them completely. The rich had fine transparent ones, while those of the poor were of coarse thick stuff. At first these veils were worn closed, but during the sermon they were opened for the sake of comfort. About 30 men were baptized. Most of them were servants and people from a distance who had come hither after John's imprisonment. Jesus took a walk with the people through the vineyards, and the fruits of which were ripening for the second time that year. Monday, October 23rd. Jesus left Mickhmethath with 5 disciples. The 2 disciples of John had gone back to Machirus, and descended by the road, or the road by which he had come. The little stream in the valley to the south of Aser Michmethath had its source in the fountain at which Jesus had given baptism by means of the disciples. He proceeded about 3 hours westward along the valley at the southern foot of the mountain upon which Thebes and Samaria lay. He gave instructions to the shepherds whom he met along the way, and toward noon reached the field that Jacob had destined for the special inheritance of Joseph. It lay in the valley to the south of Samaria and extended from east to west, 1 hour long and a half broad. The brook flowed westward through that valley. From the vineyards on the heights around could be seen Shechem a couple of hours to the south. It had everything to make it desirable: vineyards, pastured lands, grain, orchards, and water, besides the necessary buildings, all in good order. The landlord of this property was leaseholder, for it now belonged to Herod. It was a house at which the Blessed Virgin and the holy women awaited the coming of Jesus from Shechem, and in which he cured the boy. The people here were very good. They assembled in the crowds to hear Jesus' instruction, after which he tendered to him a dinner in the open air, which he graciously accepted. This special patrimony of Joseph was not the field near Shechem which Jacob had purchased from Hamor. It was another property upon which the Amorites had a footing along with the rightful occupants. They were dwelling on it at the time of the purchase, and Jacob was obliged to drive them off. He did not relish the proximity, fearing lest his own people would intermarry among them. A kind of single combat or amicable contention took place between the two parties. It had been agreed upon that the one who broke his opponent's sword or shield or struck it out of his hand should take possession of the land, the other having to retire. They decided the question in another way also, namely, by shooting at a certain boundary with the bow and arrow. Jacob and the Amorite leader took their places opposite of each other, each attended by a certain number of his own followers standing in the rear. The struggle began. Jacob conquered his adversary, and the latter had to remove. After the conquest, they made a treaty. All this took place after the purchase of the field. Jacob dwelt 11 years near Shechem. From this place, Jesus again ascended the mountain northwestwardly to Meroz, a city on the southern side of a mountain on whose northern side stood Ataroth. Meroz was built on a higher elevation than Samaria, as well as Thebez off to the north and Aser Michmethath to the east. And that concludes the reading. All right, so I said I would go over the notes, and here it is. Aser and Michmethath are supposed to be brother cities. But let's dig into this. Ephraim and Manasseh are the two sons of Joseph, the son of Jacob/Israel. And Joseph was by far the most accomplished and worthy of Jacob's sons, though he did not maintain the bloodline, for that right was given to Judah. I'd say the bloodline, the germ. The germ is what Anne Catherine refers it to. It was a strong theme in Genesis not to have one's sons or daughters mix with other races, because it diluted their religious practices as well. We see that warning in Genesis 4-6, right? There was one pure germ while the rest were just all corrupted. And so what corruption is it marks a person's intent by destroying their intent and replacing their intent with something lower. So when something gets corrupted, it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. So anyways, the story of Dinah was one such warning in Genesis, that they allowed the daughter strayed and was seduced by a local tribe. So she went into, in this text, in her Eve-like curiosity and got seduced. This is how Simeon and Levi lost the germ, which was passed down to Judah, because they went and slaughtered the clan while they were weakened, because they had actually agreed to circumcision. So anyways, in the text, we learned that Michmethath was a southern city, which belonged to Ephraim, while on the northern side was Aser, or Asher, owned by the Manasseh. Obed's house was Ephraim. It was just outside the boundaries of Michmethath. The name means hidden place. That's what Michmethath means. It was in reference to, it's referenced in the Bible in Joshua 16-17. Now, Aser, Asher means happy or blessed. Now, here's the funny part. Jesus was telling them that the law was going to get taken from the Jews and given to the Gentiles. So this is so hard a teaching that they struggle with it to this day and act exactly as the Pharisees did in the text. They look down their noses at Jesus for having visited the lesser city first, right? So the theme is that the firstborn always gets more complacent, which is a theme of the older versus younger brother in Genesis. The complacence leads to a spiritual stagnancy, and the ones who are uncomfortable become more spiritual because they default to it, because they are never materially powerful, and therefore they are never comfortable. Cain is older than Abel. Ishmael is older than Isaac. Esau's older than Jacob by like 5 minutes. Reuben and Simeon and Levi are older than Judah, and they're all older than Joseph. The younger always ends up getting the inheritance, not really in Joseph's case, but sort of. And we even have at the very end of Genesis, when Jacob/Israel is blessing his sons, Manasseh is the older child, and we refer that to Asher in this city, the city of Asher. And Ephraim is the younger child, which is Michmethath. And Jacob gives Ephraim the greater blessing, the right hand, despite, because he crossed his arms, despite Joseph intending for Manasseh getting the greater blessing, because Manasseh was the older brother. Now this is Genesis 48:12-15. Obed, the elder Jesus is giving hospitality to Jesus, he expresses regret letting two of his daughters marry into Asher, because what happened to this region is that when Solomon died, the kingdom split. This was back in 600 so AD or 700, somewhere around there. Manasseh and Ephraim, being the half-tribes of Joseph, had fallen away from Judah. They were part of the second kingdom, so they were quote-unquote sea-washed. That is, they were the Samaritans. They were made because they had mixed more with the pagans than Judah did, and this mixing would also often hollow them out or dilute them. Obed, however, is patriarchal, very traditional. I said that this is important because he applies that very Genesis manner to his household. And whom does he revere? The patriarchs, Abraham and Job. So he splits the men and women. The women have to be modest. This is much like the Essenes were doing. The women have stewardship over the household, teaching the children, while Obed takes the place of a judge, and he makes sure that they are charitable and that they consolidate their families into a strong society. But patriarch is synonymous with hierarchical. Women always fight for equal structure, while men always fight for hierarchical, patriarchal structure. Now, Obed was like their king, so Jesus chose Obed's house for the hospitality as a reward for Obed's well-ordered manner of being, his well-ordered household. So if you recall, I said there's a natural catechesis that's strong among the shepherds. There's also a strong catechesis in a patriarchal household. Obed's concern that the Gentiles would go complacent was a proper one, and Jesus told them that they would actually be grateful for it by telling him the parable of the laborers, that the ones at 3 o'clock, and 3 o'clock is symbolic in that Jesus died at that hour, so his salvation came upon the whole world for everyone to accept, but the workers who accepted at 3 o'clock were the most grateful. So the ones who accept the salvation of Christ became some of his most faithful. So again, to this day, this is a hot topic. We have big debaters like Dinesh D'Souza and other people who, and I would call them the usurers of our time, the congratulators of American capitalism, that are arguing against Christians who believe in quote-unquote supersessionism and replacement theology, as if those are things that are wrong. So people tend to invent labels as pejoratives to assert dominance over others, like those leftists who have to call everybody a Nazi or a fascist. And these are diabolical tactics. Father Chad Ripperger often calls it McCarthyism. So if you look that up, educate yourself. It's a good way to package the method. However, in our times, we just call this Catholicism, and we already had their error labeled. It was called dispensationalism. So we can sit here and ism all day, but it doesn't make for productive conversation. Anyways, Ave Maria.